Probably the most widely misunderstood book title in the history of publishing, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, is frequently referenced without actually being read. We all do this. We all have limits to our attention and competing demands on it, and so we'll often look at something but not actually read it. For example, I had at least one lecture as a student from Francis Fukuyama in the wake of him becoming famous for the book The End of History, but I have no idea what that lecture was about. And it's not just because it was a long time ago. I do remember the lunch I had with the attractive young woman who was in the lecture later that day. The End of History began its life in print as a 16-page article in a magazine called The National Interest. And it begins with an empirical observation that in 1989 there seemed to be a major change afoot in the world. Gorbachev was in the process of dismantling the Soviet Union, China was liberalizing economically, big things were happening, and Fukuyama diagnosed those in terms of ideology. The triumph of the West, of the Western idea, is evident first of all in the total exhaustion of viable, systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. And this is the central thesis, one of political philosophy, not history. That what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, end of history as such. That is, the end of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. By end of history, Fukuyama means that liberal democracy, while not becoming universal, stops having ideological contenders. That's not really how the phrase was used before the article. In the 19th century, it meant the purpose of studying history, or in the 20th, it began to mean an existential stop to human activity. But that's fine, words are just labels, and Fukuyama is clear enough about what is meant in the book. However, it's wrong. It is important to say that. Academics often, when trying to communicate nuance, end up equivocating. But it's important to recognise when something is just wrong. And Fukuyama tends to use bad criticism, misunderstandings of the thesis, as a smokescreen for it being fairly obviously incorrect. To be right, it would be necessary that fascism and communism were the last challenges to liberal democracy. And it turns out they haven't been. Since 1989, there have been other ideological challenges. Theocracy and technocracy spring to mind. Iran might have seemed like an aberration at the time, but since the publication, the United States, Turkey, India and Israel have all flirted with the rolling back of secularism, and the Taliban in Afghanistan haven't just won battles of legitimacy with local warlordism, they've won them with Western democracies. And within the European Union, there has been a notable advocacy for technocracy, the advantage of efficient, self-replicating utilitarian bureaucracies over the whims of democratic institutions. It doesn't matter how serious you think these threats are, or how you characterise whatever it is the government of China is now advocating. The point is that if Fukuyama had been right, these new ideological challenges would not have arisen, and clearly they did. Which, and now comes the nuance as I feel I've avoided the danger of equivocation, means we need to consider a slightly revised version of the thesis. Let us pretend that instead of saying that liberal democracy had seen off its last ideological contenders, that we are at the end of history, that instead Fukuyama was saying liberal democracy would eventually see off its ideological contenders, even those that had not yet arrived. That the end of history was not quite here, but that it was, albeit distantly, in sight. And with that, I want to turn from the article to the subsequent book. Published in 1992, the book keeps the main argument, but adds nuance and length. A lot of length. The prose is turgid, frequently inconsistent, error-prone, and frankly annoying. Sometimes Athens is a democracy, sometimes it's not. It's often tone deaf on US slavery. There are moments of lucidity, but a lot of it comes across as blinkered, self-congratulatory puff. Obviously, this is partly subjective. I just really don't like the style. But it means that in what follows, to give it a fair hearing, I'm going to present to you what I see as the best version of the argument. There is going to be a gap between my presentation and the actual text. I am going to have glossed over some of the errors and problems that are there. So just be aware that what you're listening to is my interpretation, not what Fukuyama wrote. Part 1 of 5 discusses the crisis of authoritarianism. This is a restatement in more detail of the empirical observation from the article that liberal democracy had apparently gained an ascendancy over other forms of government at the time of writing. Then, in Part 2, Fukuyama does add some nuance to his original article by defining a little better what it is that has won out. In an important self-reflective move, the system is now described as consisting of 3 components: capitalism, liberalism, and democracy, any one of which could exist without the others, but which as a particular combination are what Fukuyama believes constitutes the final political form. This section argues it's pretty obvious why capitalism, in the sense of free markets and private enterprise, and liberalism, in the sense of rule of law and private freedoms, have won out. The economic and scientific advantages they provide to states are decisive. But that is not true of democracy. It seems fairly clear that the preference for democracy is not dictated by the logic of the industrialization process itself. Indeed, the logic of that process would seem to point in quite the opposite direction. For if a country's goal is economic growth above all other considerations, the truly winning combination would appear to be the combination of liberal economics and authoritarian politics. This sets up Part 3. Part 3 is dedicated to explaining why democracy is a necessary component of the triumphant political system, and it discusses at length Fukuyama's concept of thumos. Fukuyama recognises that you cannot just point to the success of democracy in the past and assert that because it has been so, it must be so in the future. A historicist approach, no matter how sophisticated, nonetheless suffers from the following problem. How do we know that an apparent lack of contradictions in the apparently victorious social system, here liberal democracy, is not illusory? Without an underlying concept of human nature, it would be impossible to know whether an apparent social peace represented true satisfaction of human longings. To justify democracy as a component of the final stage of human political development, the book argues it fulfills a basic human need in a way other systems of government cannot. And the characteristic it argues for is thumos, the desire for recognition, acknowledgement of your sense of dignity and self-worth by others. What is at stake for us when we choose to live in a liberal democracy is recognition of our dignity. Life in a liberal democracy shows us the way to the completely non-material end of recognition of our freedom. Thus, both the desiring and thumotic parts of our souls find satisfaction. A lot of time is spent on thumos, but with Part 3 completed, the book has essentially presented its whole thesis. A political unit that wishes to perpetuate itself needs to adopt capitalism, liberalism, and democracy. Without capitalism, it will fall behind its peers economically, without liberalism, scientifically, and in either case its political order will be destroyed by external forces. Without democracy, it will offend the thumos of its populace and be brought down internally. Other political orders can exist, and liberal democracies can fail. Only liberal democracies can perpetuate themselves indefinitely. And if we read sympathetically, with that much more limited claim, stripped of some of the book's hyperbole, then it can sound quite convincing. We will see that people did not find it convincing, but we can wait to the critiques section before we actually discuss that. From here, parts 4 and 5 are basically all nuance. Fukuyama never claimed, even in the strong version in the text, that any of this meant countries would all become liberal democracies now, or anytime soon, and these sections talk about why. Ideological alternatives, realism theory, nationalism, uneven development, social inequality, family and community breakdown, discontents, and relativism are all discussed. Some of it reads at odds with the first 3 chapters. It's frustrating that only now, 200 pages too late, does Fukuyama acknowledge ideological alternatives. And in the final pages, nuance often seems to be a disavowal of the central argument. For example, Fukuyama finishes with the analogy of a wagon train making its way to a single town on a long and difficult road, and writes, "The direction of the wagon's wanderings must remain provisionally inconclusive, nor can we in the final analysis know, provided a majority reach the town, whether their occupants will not find them inadequate and set their eyes on a new and more distant journey." Which is, in metaphorical terms, almost the exact opposite of the literal argument in the first 200 pages. Does the end of history believe in its own argument? I'm not sure. Certainly no one else seems to have believed it, but I'm going to start with my own personal problem. To me, the crux of the argument is Fukuyama's concept of thumos, the human need political systems must satisfy. And the book discusses a bunch of thinkers: Hegel, Hume, Locke, Plato, Smith, Tocqueville, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Hamilton, Nietzsche. But it doesn't discuss evolutionary biology, psychology, the science of happiness, anthropology, neuroscience, and so on. Just to be clear, I don't know anywhere near enough about those different academic fields to know whether or not they are collectively capable of answering the questions: is there a single human need that political systems need to satisfy, and what is that political need? What I do know with absolute certainty is this bunch of dead white guys have no idea what they're talking about, and their armchair philosophical speculations are worthless for the question Fukuyama is asking. This is just the wrong place to be looking. There is no way people who have been dead for centuries could possibly have access to enough information to answer that question. Armchair philosophy is useful as a tool to help you learn how to think critically, precisely because of its simplistic, data-light approach to questions. But it can't resolve complex real-world problems. That can only be done by deploying domain-specific skills on actual data. Just as armchair philosophers spent thousands of years getting how gravity works wrong or misunderstanding the invention of money, here Fukuyama uses it to get the development of political systems wrong. Often cleverly, but always wrong, because the approach throughout is to sit back and try and make sense of what is happening using analogies to commonplace knowledge shared with the audience. Which is why sometimes Athens is a democracy, and sometimes it's not. Why the book consistently confuses 20th century democracies and pre-20th century republics. Why, so often, it seems to suggest fascism started in Germany, or simply erased slavery in the United States. Because any time an example is used, it isn't data. It is purely an analogy, and it is intended to mean what it means in that moment and nothing more. To me, that is the most damning critique of the book. But the relative merit that you accord to different critiques is invariably subjective. So I spent a whole afternoon sitting down and reading through reviews in order to try and get a sense of the critiques other people had deployed against Fukuyama's thesis. No word clouds today, but lots of quotations will appear on the screen. A minority of reviewers are keen to point out that the end of history does not appear to understand Hegel. Since I don't think Hegel is useful, that doesn't bother me, but there is a section of the philosophical community for whom the notoriously obtuse German is a totemic figure, whose insight needs to be defended and whose misuse condemned. A lot of reviewers obviously have the same issues I do. Both the issue that Fukuyama is looking for answers in the wrong place and that subsequent events clearly demonstrated the argument was wrong. Some read Fukuyama as an apologist for existing politics or romantic for a system he personally benefits from, though, to be fair, those are explanations of flaws rather than actual flaws. More serious, and in the same vein, is the treatment of the global south. Fukuyama doesn't ignore global inequality, but his arguments often feel slight, slightly icky, and it looks doubtful that any of them would hold up to close scrutiny. In fact, there is a general sense in reviews that Fukuyama is just not a top-rate thinker, or at least that End of History contains a lot of muddled, half-baked and theoretically unsophisticated arguments. You might notice a paucity of feminist critiques if looking at reviews, given the book is every bit as bad as you would expect of a male American right-wing conservative in the 1990s. I can, for example, envisage an interesting talk juxtaposing Fukuyama's concept of thumos and a feminist reading of toxic masculinity. Some reviewers see the author as a shill, trying to produce plausible-sounding justification for vested interests. And for a lot of historians, this all just seems very old. What Fukuyama calls the end of history is better known in historical circles as Whig history, teleology, or grand narrative. And in historical study, for theoretical and empirical reasons, there's very little faith in those sorts of approaches, and the book simply does not engage with those criticisms. Given all that, you might be asking if there are any positive reviews. If there are positive reviews, I haven't seen them. I haven't done a systematic examination of the review literature, so it is possible that there are positive responses out there that I have missed. But what was lacking in my reading was any of that normal sense of there being a division between critics and acolytes in the reviewers. That is what I almost always encounter when I look at a work that is this widely talked about and discussed. As Fukuyama wrote of his original article, I have come to realise that my real accomplishment has been to produce a uniquely universal consensus, not on the current state of liberalism, but on the fact that I was wrong and that history has not, in fact, ended. It is difficult to shake the sense that everyone knows Fukuyama's thesis is wrong and that the reasons are fairly obvious, and the book is being used as a wicker man to excise the sense of Western triumphalism that pervaded the 1990s. And that makes me a little uncomfortable in offering a reading, something I always do at the end of one of these episodes. I don't feel I need to know any more about the end of history, and I would, if I was offering a reading, recommend the original article, which is just 16 pages long and does cover all of the really key parts of the thesis. But I do come to the end of this episode wanting to understand the reception of the book better, and feeling strongly that it should be read more as a cultural artefact than a thesis, and any reading framed by context and questions. But it does remain an interesting departure point for discussing how we use our understanding of the past. In 19th century parlance, to what end we put history. But for now, thank you for listening.